Dr. Sarah Martinez clutched her oversized black duffel bag tighter as she walked through the bustling international terminal at Denver Airport. The bag looked completely out of place among the sleek rolling suitcases and designer carry-ons of her fellow passengers. Several people shot her curious glances, and she could hear muffled chuckles from a group of business travelers nearby. "Look at that thing," whispered one woman in an expensive suit to her companion. "It's like she's carrying camping gear to a business conference." Sarah's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she kept walking toward her gate. The bag was indeed bulky and awkward, its weathered exterior making it look like military surplus gear. What the laughing passengers didn't know was that inside this unremarkable bag lay some of the most sophisticated seismic monitoring equipment in the world, worth more than most people's annual salaries. As a senior geologist for the United States Geological Survey, Sarah had been called to an emergency assignment in Guatemala. A series of unusual earthquake patterns had been detected near several volcanic sites, and local scientists were requesting immediate assistance from American experts. The situation was delicate. The equipment she carried was classified technology, designed to detect underground nuclear testing, but it could also provide unprecedented insight into volcanic activity. The bag contained 3 highly sensitive seismometers, each no bigger than a smartphone, but capable of detecting ground movement as small as 1 nanometer. These weren't available to the public and required special clearance to transport internationally. Sarah had spent 2 days getting the proper documentation and permits, working with both the State Department and Guatemalan authorities to ensure legal passage. At the security checkpoint, Sarah's heart raced as TSA agents examined her documentation. The equipment required special handling protocols, and she had to present classified clearance papers that most security personnel had never seen before. A supervisor was called over, then another, as they scrutinized the unusual items showing up on their X-ray screens. "Ma'am, we're going to need to do a manual inspection," announced the lead security officer, his voice carrying across the checkpoint area. Several passengers in line behind Sarah groaned audibly, checking their watches with obvious irritation. Sarah nodded and followed the officer to a private screening area, dragging her bulky bag behind her. She could hear more comments from the waiting passengers about people who don't know how to pack properly and probably some kind of survivalist. The manual inspection took 45 minutes. Each piece of equipment had to be carefully removed, documented, and tested. The seismometers looked like ordinary electronic devices to untrained eyes, but their internal components were incredibly sophisticated. Sarah had to explain the purpose of each item while TSA officers contacted federal authorities to verify her credentials. During the wait, Sarah reflected on her journey to this moment. She had grown up in a small mining town in Colorado where earthquakes were a constant concern due to underground blasting operations. Her father had worked in the mines, and she remembered the fear in his eyes whenever the ground shook more than usual. That fear had driven her to study geology, determined to understand and predict these powerful forces of nature. After completing her PhD at Stanford, Sarah had joined the USGS and quickly made a name for herself in seismic research. She had developed new techniques for analyzing earthquake patterns and had been part of teams that successfully predicted several significant seismic events. Her work had saved countless lives, but it often required her to travel to remote and dangerous locations with sensitive equipment. The TSA supervisor finally returned with approval for her equipment, but not before examining every cable, sensor, and calibration tool in her bag. Sarah carefully repacked everything, making sure each delicate instrument was properly cushioned. The seismometers alone cost $80,000 each, and their specialized sensors could be damaged by excessive vibration or temperature changes. As she made her way to the departure gate, Sarah noticed the same group of business travelers who had been laughing at her earlier. They were now dealing with their own security delays, apparently having some issues with liquid restrictions in their perfectly organized carry-on bags. One of them, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, was arguing loudly with a TSA agent about having to throw away a bottle of cologne that exceeded size limits. Sarah found a quiet corner near her gate and carefully checked her equipment one more time. The seismometers needed to be calibrated before use, and she wanted to make sure the airline journey hadn't affected their sensitive internal mechanisms. She pulled out a small laptop and connected it to the first device, running a quick diagnostic check. The readouts looked good, showing normal baseline measurements for the airport environment. These instruments could detect vibrations from passing aircraft, foot traffic, and even nearby construction work. In Guatemala, they would be used to monitor underground magma movement and predict potential volcanic eruptions that could threaten nearby villages. While running her equipment checks, Sarah noticed a young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, watching her with fascination from the next row of seats. The child's eyes were wide with curiosity as she observed Sarah connecting various cables and watching numbers scroll across the laptop screen. "Are you a scientist?" the girl asked, approaching Sarah's seat with the bold confidence that only children possess. Sarah smiled, remembering her own childhood fascination with mysterious adult activities. "Yes, I am. I study earthquakes." "Earthquakes?" The girl's eyes grew even wider. "Can you make them happen?" Sarah laughed gently. "No, I can't make them happen. But these special tools help me understand when they might happen, so people can be safe." The girl's mother appeared, looking embarrassed about her daughter's interruption. "I'm sorry, she's very curious about everything." "No problem at all," Sarah replied. Curiosity is what makes good scientists. As the boarding announcement began, Sarah carefully packed away her laptop and made sure her equipment bag was securely closed. The long flight to Guatemala City would give her time to review the geological data that had prompted this urgent mission. Preliminary reports suggested unusual seismic activity that didn't match typical earthquake patterns, and local volcanologists were concerned about potential eruptions. The business travelers who had mocked her bag earlier were boarding in first class, wheeling their sleek luggage down the jet bridge. Sarah smiled to herself, knowing that while their bags might look more professional, they contained nothing more valuable than clothing and toiletries. Her bulky military surplus bag held technology that could potentially save thousands of lives. As she settled into her economy seat for the 6-hour flight, Sarah opened her research files and began studying satellite images of the Guatemalan volcanic region. The images showed subtle changes in ground elevation and surface temperature that suggested significant underground activity. Combined with the seismic readings that had triggered this mission, the data painted a concerning picture of potential volcanic unrest. Sarah had worked in volcanic regions before, but never with such advanced equipment and never under such urgent circumstances. The Guatemalan government was keeping the situation quiet to avoid panic, but they desperately needed accurate predictions about potential eruptions. The villages scattered around the volcanic complex housed nearly 50,000 people, many of whom had lived there for generations and would be reluctant to evacuate without solid evidence of danger. The plane lifted off from Denver as Sarah continued her research, her precious cargo safely stowed in the overhead compartment above her seat. None of her fellow passengers could have guessed that the laughably bulky bag they had mocked contained humanity's best hope for understanding and predicting one of nature's most destructive forces. The humid air of Guatemala City hit Sarah like a warm blanket as she stepped off the plane at La Aurora International Airport. Her bulky bag felt even heavier in the tropical climate, and she could feel sweat beginning to form on her forehead as she made her way through the crowded terminal. The customs process proved to be another challenge, as Guatemalan officials needed to verify her scientific equipment permits once again. Dr. Carlos Mendoza, the lead volcanologist from Guatemala's National Institute of Seismology, was waiting for her in the arrival area. His weathered face showed the strain of recent sleepless nights, and his handshake was firm but urgent when he greeted Sarah. "Dr. Martinez, thank goodness you're here," Carlos said in accented English, eyeing her equipment bag with obvious relief. "The situation has become more critical since we spoke 3 days ago. We've recorded 17 new micro-earthquakes just this morning, and the pattern is unlike anything we've seen before." As they drove through the busy streets of Guatemala City toward the research center, Carlos explained the developing crisis. The Santiaguito volcanic complex, located about 120 kilometers west of the capital, had been showing unusual activity for the past 2 weeks. Local residents had reported strange sounds coming from underground, and several natural hot springs had begun producing sulfur-scented steam. "The traditional monitoring equipment we have is giving us conflicting readings," Carlos continued, navigating through heavy traffic while explaining the technical details. "Some sensors show increasing seismic activity, others show normal background levels. We need your advanced equipment to understand what's really happening beneath the surface." Sarah listened carefully while watching the landscape change from urban sprawl to rural countryside as they headed toward the volcanic region. The implications were serious. Santiaguito was surrounded by dozens of small villages and agricultural communities. A major eruption could displace thousands of people and destroy centuries-old communities that had learned to live with volcanic soil's benefits while ignoring its dangers. They stopped first at the temporary research station that Guatemalan scientists had established in the town of Quetzaltenango, about 30 kilometers from the volcanic complex. The facility was modest compared to the high-tech laboratories Sarah was accustomed to working in, but it was equipped with basic geological monitoring equipment and communication systems needed to coordinate an emergency response. Sarah carefully unpacked her equipment, while Carlos assembled his team of local scientists and graduate students. The seismometers needed to be deployed at specific locations around the volcanic complex to create a triangulated monitoring network. Each device would need to be buried at precise depths and calibrated to account for local soil conditions and background vibration levels. The first deployment site was located on a hillside overlooking the main volcanic crater. Sarah and 2 Guatemalan graduate students hiked for 2 hours through dense vegetation, carrying the delicate equipment in protective cases. The location offered an excellent vantage point for monitoring underground activity, but reaching it required crossing unstable terrain and navigating around recent landslide areas. As Sarah carefully installed the first seismometer, she explained to the graduate students how the device worked. The instrument would detect ground movement in 3 dimensions, measuring both primary waves that traveled directly through the Earth and secondary waves that moved along the surface. By comparing data from multiple locations, they could determine the precise location and magnitude of underground disturbances. "This equipment can detect movements smaller than the width of a human hair," Sarah explained while connecting calibration cables. "It's so sensitive that we have to account for vibrations from wind, traffic, and even large animals walking nearby." The second deployment site was located in a valley on the opposite side of the volcanic complex. This location proved even more challenging to reach, requiring a 4-wheel drive vehicle and a treacherous hike down a steep ravine. Sarah's bulky equipment bag, which had seemed so awkward in the Denver airport, now proved its worth as it protected the delicate instruments from branches, rocks, and moisture during the difficult journey. Miguel, one of the graduate students, initially struggled with the heavy equipment cases during the hike. "Why couldn't they make this equipment smaller and lighter?" he complained while pausing to rest on the steep trail. Sarah smiled, remembering similar complaints from her own graduate school days. "These instruments need mass and stability to filter out unwanted vibrations," she explained. A lighter device would pick up every small disturbance and make it impossible to detect the signals we're actually looking for. The installation process at the second site took longer than expected due to rocky soil conditions. Sarah had to recalibrate the equipment multiple times to account for the hard substrate, which transmitted vibrations differently than the softer soil at the first location. As the sun began to set, they finally achieved stable readings from both devices. Back at the research station, Sarah connected her laptop to the monitoring network and began analyzing the incoming data. The results were immediately concerning. The seismometers were detecting a constant low-frequency vibration that traditional equipment had been unable to measure. This type of signal typically indicated magma movement deep underground, suggesting that pressure was building in the volcanic system. "These readings show harmonic tremor patterns," Sarah explained to Carlos and his team, pointing to the rhythmic waveforms on her computer screen. "It's like the Earth is humming. This usually means molten rock is moving through underground channels, potentially building pressure for an eruption." Carlos studied the data with growing concern. The harmonic patterns were consistent with pre-eruption activity observed at other volcanoes around the world, but the amplitude was stronger than anything recorded at Santiaguito in the past 50 years. If the patterns continued to intensify, they would need to consider evacuation recommendations for nearby communities. Sarah worked through the night, analyzing data streams from both seismometers, while Carlos coordinated with emergency management officials. The third seismometer needed to be deployed the following day to complete the monitoring network, but its proposed location was in an area that local authorities had recently declared potentially unstable. As dawn broke over the volcanic complex, Sarah prepared for what could be the most dangerous equipment deployment of her career. The third monitoring site was located directly on the lower slopes of the active volcanic cone, where recent ground deformation had created visible cracks and small sinkholes. Getting the equipment to this location would require helicopter transport, as ground access had become too dangerous. The helicopter pilot, an experienced local aviator named Roberto, examined Sarah's equipment bag with skepticism when they met at the small airstrip outside Quetzaltenango. "This bag is quite heavy for helicopter transport to that location," he said in Spanish, which Carlos translated. "The landing zone is very small, and we can only spend a few minutes on the ground." Sarah had anticipated this challenge and had prepared a rapid deployment protocol. The seismometer could be installed and activated in under 10 minutes if everything went according to plan, but the volcanic terrain presented numerous variables that could complicate the process. As the helicopter lifted off and headed toward the volcanic complex, Sarah reviewed her deployment checklist one final time. The third seismometer would provide the triangulation data needed to precisely locate underground activity, but only if they could successfully install it in the planned location. Looking down at the rugged volcanic landscape below, Sarah realized that her bulky, military surplus equipment bag was about to prove its worth in ways that those laughing airport passengers could never have imagined. The volcanic slopes grew larger as they approached the deployment site, and Sarah could see steam rising from several ground fissures that had opened recently. The helicopter began to descend toward a small clearing on the unstable volcanic slope, where Sarah would have just minutes to install equipment that could potentially save thousands of lives. The helicopter touched down on the volcanic slope with a jarring thud, and Sarah immediately felt the ground trembling beneath her feet. The landing zone was smaller than anticipated, with loose volcanic rock and visible steam vents just meters away. Roberto kept the engine running, ready for immediate takeoff if conditions became too dangerous. Sarah grabbed her equipment bag and ran toward the predetermined installation site, fighting against the downdraft from the helicopter rotors. The ground felt unstable, with each step sending small rocks cascading down the slope. Steam hissed from nearby fissures, carrying the acrid smell of sulfur that made her eyes water and throat burn. Working with practiced efficiency, Sarah unpacked the third seismometer while constantly monitoring the ground conditions around her. The volcanic soil was hot to the touch, and she could hear rumbling sounds coming from deep underground. These were signs that the volcanic system was highly active, making the installation both more dangerous and more critical. The installation process that normally took 20 minutes had to be completed in less than 10 due to the helicopter's fuel limitations and the increasingly unstable ground conditions. Sarah drilled the mounting hole with a portable battery-powered auger, installed the seismometer housing, and connected the calibration equipment with movements that had been perfected through years of fieldwork experience. As she activated the device and checked its initial readings, the seismometer immediately detected vibrations that were significantly stronger than those recorded at the other two locations. The amplitude readings were so high that Sarah initially thought there might be equipment malfunction, but a quick diagnostic confirmed that the device was working perfectly. The volcanic system was generating seismic activity that was off the charts. Roberto shouted from the helicopter that they needed to leave immediately. Ground deformation around the landing zone was becoming visible in real time, with small cracks appearing in the volcanic rock. Sarah quickly completed the final calibration sequence, grabbed her equipment bag, and ran back to the helicopter as steam began erupting from a fissure that had just opened 10 meters away. The flight back to the research station was tense, with Sarah monitoring the incoming data from all 3 seismometers on her laptop, while Roberto navigated around increasing volcanic activity. The triangulated readings now provided a complete picture of what was happening beneath Santiaguito, and the results were alarming. The 3 seismometers were detecting a massive magma intrusion occurring approximately 4 kilometers beneath the volcanic complex. The molten rock was moving upward through underground channels at a rate that suggested a major eruption could occur within days rather than weeks. The harmonic tremor patterns were intensifying, and ground deformation measurements indicated that the volcanic cone was literally swelling as pressure built underground. Back at the research station, Sarah worked with Carlos to interpret the complete dataset and prepare emergency recommendations. The sophisticated seismometers were revealing details about the volcanic system that had never been detected before, providing unprecedented insight into the mechanics of an impending eruption. The data shows that magma is accumulating in a shallow chamber about 2 kilometers below the main crater, Sarah explained to the assembled team of scientists and emergency officials. Based on the pressure buildup rate and historical patterns from similar volcanoes, we're looking at a high probability of significant eruption activity within the next 72 hours. The emergency management coordinator, a serious woman named Maria Elena Vargas, studied the seismic data charts with obvious concern. "What kind of evacuation radius would you recommend, Dr. Martinez?" Sarah consulted her analysis of the pressure measurements and ground deformation data. "Based on these readings, I would recommend evacuating all residents within a 15-kilometer radius of the main crater. The data suggests this could be a VEI-4 eruption, which means significant ashfall, pyroclastic flows, and potential lahar formation." The evacuation recommendation affected 47 villages and approximately 38,000 people. Many of these communities had lived in the volcanic region for generations, farming the fertile volcanic soil and adapting their lives to periodic minor eruptions. Convincing them to leave their homes and livelihoods based on seismic data would require careful communication and community leadership support. Carlos coordinated with local mayors and community leaders, while Sarah continued monitoring the real-time data feeds from her seismometer network. The readings showed that underground pressure was continuing to build, with new fracture patterns appearing in the rock formations around the magma chamber. The sophisticated equipment was providing hourly updates that allowed for precise tracking of the volcanic system's evolution. On the second day of monitoring, Sarah's equipment detected a significant change in the seismic patterns. The harmonic tremor that had been constant for the previous week suddenly shifted to sharp, irregular pulses that indicated the beginning of actual eruption processes. Magma had begun moving from the deep chamber toward the surface, and the volcanic system was transitioning from preparation to active eruption. "We need to accelerate the evacuation timeline," Sarah announced to the emergency coordination team. "These new readings suggest that eruption onset could occur within 12 to 24 hours rather than the 72 hours we originally estimated." The evacuation efforts intensified dramatically, with military vehicles and emergency buses deployed to transport residents from the most vulnerable communities. Sarah's precise location data for the underground activity allowed evacuation coordinators to prioritize areas that would be most severely affected by pyroclastic flows and ashfall. As evacuation efforts continued, Sarah maintained constant contact with her seismometer network, providing real-time updates to emergency coordinators. The military surplus bag that had looked so awkward and unprofessional at the Denver airport had delivered technology that was now guiding one of the largest volcanic evacuations in Guatemalan history. 26 hours after the seismic pattern change, Santiaguito erupted with spectacular violence. The initial explosion sent an ash column 15 kilometers into the atmosphere, visible from Guatemala City despite the distance. Pyroclastic flows raced down the volcanic slopes at speeds exceeding 200 kilometers per hour, destroying everything in their path, but finding only evacuated villages. Sarah's seismometer network continued operating throughout the eruption, providing unprecedented scientific data about volcanic processes. The precise timing predictions had allowed for complete evacuation of the danger zone, and no lives were lost despite the eruption's magnitude. Property damage was extensive, but the human cost had been minimized through accurate scientific prediction. International news coverage of the successful evacuation highlighted the critical role of advanced seismic monitoring technology in volcanic disaster prevention. Sarah found herself fielding interview requests from science journalists around the world, explaining how sophisticated equipment hidden in an unglamorous military surplus bag had enabled precise prediction of one of Central America's most significant volcanic events in recent history. The young girl from the Denver airport, whose curiosity about earthquake science had brightened Sarah's journey, sent a handwritten letter to the USGS after seeing news coverage of the evacuation. "Dear Earthquake Lady," the letter began, "I saw on the news that you saved lots of people with your special tools. When I grow up, I want to be a scientist like you and help keep people safe from volcanoes." 6 months later, Sarah was back at Denver Airport, once again carrying her bulky seismometer bag to another geological emergency. This time, a group of business travelers in the security line recognized her from news coverage of the Guatemala evacuation. Instead of laughing at her unglamorous equipment bag, they approached her with respect and curiosity about her scientific work. "Is that the equipment that predicted the volcano eruption?" asked one of the travelers, a middle-aged businessman who had previously complained about her bag's appearance. Sarah smiled, remembering the transformation from ridicule to respect that sometimes accompanied scientific success. "Yes, these instruments detected underground changes that warned us about the eruption in time to evacuate everyone safely." The businessman nodded with obvious admiration. "I apologize for making fun of your bag before. I had no idea you were carrying equipment that could save lives." As Sarah proceeded through security with expedited clearance now provided for her classified scientific equipment, she reflected on the importance of maintaining scientific readiness regardless of public perception. The bulky, unglamorous bag that had drawn mockery and laughter contained humanity's most sophisticated tools for understanding and predicting natural disasters. Her next assignment would take her to Indonesia, where satellite data indicated potential seismic activity near several populated volcanic islands. The same advanced seismometers that had successfully predicted the Guatemala eruption would soon be deployed in another challenging environment, hidden away in the same practical military surplus bag that prioritized function over appearance. The passengers who had once laughed at Sarah's equipment bag now watched with respect as she boarded her flight, carrying technology that represented the cutting edge of geological science. Inside that weathered black duffel bag lay instruments capable of detecting Earth movements smaller than atomic dimensions, powered by decades of scientific research and engineering innovation. As her plane lifted off from Denver, Sarah opened her laptop to review preliminary data from the Indonesian volcanic monitoring stations. The familiar weight of her equipment bag in the overhead compartment provided reassurance that she was prepared for whatever geological challenges awaited. Sometimes the most important tools come in the most unassuming packages, and sometimes the people who laugh at unusual luggage have no idea they're mocking equipment designed to save their lives.